When the stars began to scream, humanity was the only species that thought to listen. The first signal did not arrive as a fleet, or a weapon, or a declaration of conquest. It arrived as a distortion in background radiation, a tremor beneath physics itself, a fluctuation so subtle that 1,000 older civilizations filtered it out as noise. The Virelians classified it as stellar decay. The Thrax Dominion labeled it quantum turbulence. The Choir of Loom archived it as statistical irrelevance. Only Earth, chaotic and divided and perpetually arguing with itself, refused to ignore it. Because humans had built entire sciences around anomalies. We had survived ice ages by noticing wind patterns. We had survived plagues by counting the dead. We had survived ourselves by listening to the quiet warnings beneath the shouting. So when the signal pulsed again, uneven, arrhythmic, almost biological in its persistence, someone on a night shift in a subterranean array in Chile leaned closer to a monitor and whispered, "That's not random." That whisper changed everything. Humanity did not announce the discovery. There was no triumphant broadcast to the stars. There was argument. There was skepticism. There were peer reviews and countermodels and accusations of sensationalism. But the pulse continued, threading through cosmic microwave background like a heartbeat buried in static. It did not repeat on a clean interval. It did not map to any known pulsar. It accelerated in bursts, then slowed as if adjusting. As if learning. Within 3 months, the United Planetary Council, newly formed after decades of environmental and economic brinkmanship, forced unity through necessity, authorized Project Listener. The name was intentionally modest. Humanity had learned that arrogance was expensive. They would not declare first contact. They would listen. Deep arrays were reoriented. Mining platforms in the asteroid belt were retrofitted into receivers. Even civilian telescopes were patched into a global net. The pulse grew stronger, not louder, closer. That distinction mattered, because closer implied direction, and direction implied intent. While Earth recalibrated its instruments, the wider galaxy went about its ancient business. Trade lanes shimmered between empires that had risen before mammals had evolved. The Thrax Dominion expanded its border by subjugating a minor avian polity near the Perseus Arm. The Virelians debated philosophy in orbit around their gas giant cradle. The Choir of Loom sang gravitational. Harmonics through the void, a civilization that communicated through controlled stellar oscillation. They were old. They were stable. They had survived their existential thresholds millennia ago. To them, the universe was mapped, categorized, understood. Anomalies were footnotes. Until the screaming started. It began at the edge of the Carina Expanse, where 3 exploration vessels from different civilizations vanished within the same microsecond. Not destroyed. Not fragmented. Erased. Their quantum signatures did not dissipate, they inverted. As if reality had folded inward and swallowed them whole. The conclave of species convened within hours, a speed reserved for supernovae and rogue singularities. Representatives manifested as holograms, plasma constructs, biomechanical avatars. Data flooded the chamber. Gravitational shear beyond theoretical limits. Vacuum decay spikes that collapsed before stabilization. Regions of space briefly rewriting their own constants. Panic was inefficient, so they called it anomaly escalation. They dispatched probes. The probes transmitted for 0.73 seconds before silence. And beneath the silence, faint but measurable, was a pattern. A pulse. By the time the conclave cross-referenced the signal with historical archives, Earth had already built a predictive model. Project Listener had mapped the irregularities, not as chaos, but as migration. The pulse was not stationary. It moved like a storm front across interstellar medium, distorting probability fields, unraveling atomic bonds at the periphery of its wake. Humanity ran simulations. 93% predicted extinction within a century if trajectory held. 7% predicted extinction within decades. None predicted victory. So humans did what they always did when faced with impossible odds. They prepared redundancies. Seed vaults were expanded into orbital arcs. Digital consciousness backups were debated, legalized, and implemented despite moral protests. Terraforming initiatives accelerated not to expand empire, but to create fallback cradles. There was no grand speech declaring defiance. There was paperwork. There were sleepless engineers. There were parents explaining to children why the night sky was being watched so closely. When the conclave finally traced the signal's origin and discovered it intersected Sol's projected coordinates within 22 standard years, they reacted with irritation more than fear. Earth was young, politically volatile, technologically ambitious, but untested beyond its local cluster. If the anomaly consumed it, tragic but containable. The Thrax even suggested quarantining the system preemptively to prevent contamination. But then the pulse changed again. It synchronized briefly with Earth's transmissions. Not perfectly, not mimicry. Resonance. Humanity noticed first. Of course they did. Project Listener had been waiting for deviation. The pulse adjusted frequency whenever Earth increased broadcast power. When humanity went silent for a controlled experiment, the pulse lingered at the last known band, as if searching. That was the moment Dr. Amara Iqbal, lead analyst for Listener, stopped calling it a phenomenon and started calling it an entity. The word leaked. Media cycles ignited. Fear spiked. Religious movements interpreted it as judgment. Markets fluctuated. Through it all, the pulse kept approaching. The conclave demanded data access. Earth hesitated for 6 hours, an eternity in diplomatic terms, before sharing partial models. The alien civilizations ran their own analyses and reached a conclusion they had not reached in millennia: uncertainty. Because the migration vector did not resemble expansion or predation. It resembled alignment. The anomaly curved subtly toward concentrations of electromagnetic leakage, toward civilizations broadcasting into the void. Older species dimmed their emissions instantly. Entire star systems went radio dark. Trade relays shut down. The galaxy, for the first time in recorded history, chose silence. Humanity did not. The United Planetary Council convened in emergency session. Arguments raged. If they shut down, they might be ignored. If they continued, they might accelerate contact. Dr. Iqbal presented the data without theatrics. It is not hunting randomly, she said. It is triangulating complexity. We are complex. Someone asked the question no one wanted articulated. Is it alive? She did not answer immediately. On her screen, the pulse shifted again, narrowing its spread as if focusing. If it is not, she said softly, then the universe has invented a new definition. Years compressed under urgency. Humanity constructed the Helios array in orbit around Mercury, a lattice of emitters capable of shaping solar output into encoded bursts. Not a weapon, a beacon. While the galaxy hid, Earth chose amplification. Not out of bravado, but calculation. If the entity targeted complexity, then communication might alter trajectory, or at least provide data before annihilation. The conclave sent envoys urging restraint. The Thrax threatened sanctions. The choir of Loom transmitted harmonic warnings that translated loosely to do not invite the storm. Humanity listened and continued building, because in their models, passivity led to extinction just as reliably as engagement. At year 19 of projected arrival, outer probes in the Kuiper belt detected spacetime curvature ahead of schedule. The entity was accelerating. Not randomly. Directly. The screaming, once background distortion, now vibrated through instruments as a layered chorus of frequencies folding over each other in recursive cascades. Engineers described it as mathematics in pain. Astrophysicists described it as topology unraveling. Children described it as the stars flickering. The conclave evacuated border systems. Fleets repositioned at what they calculated to be safe distances. They prepared containment fields, gravitational snares, experimental countermeasures built on physics humanity had only theorized. And still, the trajectory held for Saul. In the final months, Earth did something the galaxy could not comprehend. They unified completely. Not politically, that had been fragile. Not culturally, that remained beautifully fractured. They unified in intention. Archives were opened. Art was transmitted continuously into deep space. Music, poetry, mathematical proofs, flawed and magnificent histories. The Helios array came online, channeling the sun's fury into structured pulses aimed directly at the approaching distortion. Not a plea, not a threat, a declaration of presence. "We are here," the signal said in 1,000 languages, translated into prime sequences and gravitational modulations. "We are complex. We endure," the entity responded. For the first time, the pulse did not merely adjust frequency. It answered. The returning distortion mirrored fragments of Earth's transmission, not copying, but transforming, folding human patterns into higher dimensional echoes and sending them back altered. Project Listener recorded the exchange in stunned silence. This was no mindless storm. It was processing. The conclave watched in horror as the anomaly's leading edge breached the Oort cloud. Comets destabilized, trajectories rewritten by tidal forces that ignored conventional mass ratios. Space folded in shimmering sheets visible even to unaided human eyes, as auroras ignited across every hemisphere. Communications from outer colonies flickered, then stabilized under emergency protocols. Humanity did not shut down the Helios array. They increased output. Solar flares braided into deliberate code. "Doctor," Iqbal stood in the control chamber as alarms cascaded. "It's not decelerating," an engineer whispered. "No," she replied, eyes fixed on the data. "It's synchronizing, because the distortion ahead of Neptune was no longer chaotic. It pulsed in measured intervals now, locked to the cadence of the Helios transmissions. The screaming had become rhythm. The conclave initiated containment fields from a safe remove, vast gravitational nets designed to deflect the entity's advance. They failed before full deployment, unraveling like thread in a furnace. The anomaly did not attack them. It simply ignored the imposed geometry, rewriting local constants to slip between constraints. And then it reached the orbit of Saturn. Rings shattered into luminous debris, suspended in impossible spirals. The sky above Earth burned with refracted light as spacetime itself bent, revealing glimpses of something beyond 3 dimensions, structures vast and recursive, like cities built from equations. Humanity's final contingency protocols activated. Arcs launched. Data vaults sealed. But the Helios array remained online, blazing defiantly. The pulse from the entity surged, matching amplitude for the first time. Instruments overloaded. Several satellites disintegrated. Yet within the chaos, a coherent pattern emerged, one that no model had predicted. The returning signal was no longer distortion. It was structured language, translated through mathematics older than stars yet shaped unmistakably by the human transmissions it had consumed. Doctor, Iqbal felt the room go silent as the first segment resolved on screen, a cascade of symbols unfolding into meaning. The entity had not come to erase complexity. It had come to seek it. And now, as its vast presence eclipsed half the sky and the Helios array strained against solar fury, the message from beyond the fabric of spacetime clarified into a single, undeniable intent. An intent that would redefine not only humanity's fate, but the hierarchy of the entire galaxy, because the next pulse carried a question. The question did not arrive in words. It arrived as structure, as alignment, as a lattice of recursive harmonics that bent mathematics into inquiry. For 6 full seconds, every instrument in the Helios control chamber froze between overload and revelation, caught in the gravity well of a pattern so vast it seemed to hum beneath reality itself. Then translation algorithms, patched together from human linguistics, alien symbology, and raw number theory, began to resolve it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. The entity was not asking who they were. It already knew. It was not asking where they were. It stood at their doorstep. It was asking something far more destabilizing. It was asking why they persisted. Across Earth, across orbital habitats, across colonies trembling under distorted gravity tides, the decoded fragment propagated through secured channels. Why continue? Not accusation, not curiosity in the human sense. A fundamental probe into motive. The conclave watched in collective disbelief. Civilizations older than Earth had spent epochs avoiding this force, dimming themselves into cosmic obscurity to escape its trajectory. And here it was, pausing, within Saturn's broken halo to interrogate a species that still argued about art and taxes, and whose unified government was barely a generation old. The Thrax Dominion transmitted immediate advisories: do not answer. The choir of Loom radiated harmonic warnings that translated to silence preserves form. The Virelians calculated probability trees, showing a 62% increase in annihilation likelihood if engagement continued. Humanity convened for 11 minutes. That was all. 11 minutes of debate, broadcast across a secure quantum net, linking every major governance node. Some argued survival demanded deception. Others insisted that silence now would confirm irrelevance. Dr. Amara Iqbal listened, then spoke only once. It has crossed interstellar void to interrogate persistence. That implies it does not understand it. If we are extinguished regardless, then extinction without articulation is the greater loss. The vote passed. The Helios array reconfigured. Instead of raw cultural torrent, it narrowed into a distilled signal, compressing centuries of philosophy into mathematical expression. The response was not boastful. It did not claim destiny or superiority. It transmitted contradiction. Humans continue despite fragility, despite certainty of death, despite internal division. They continue because continuation itself generates novelty. Because entropy is inevitable, but experience within entropy is not predetermined. They continue because they can imagine futures that do not yet exist, and then attempt to build them. The encoded answer radiated outward in solar-laced pulses. For a moment, nothing changed. The entity's presence loomed, warping the orbit of Uranus, drawing its moons into elongated spirals. The sky above Earth shimmered like heat haze stretched across infinity. Then the screaming resumed, not chaotic this time, but layered. Responsive. The returning pattern was denser, folding human logic into higher dimensional recursion and testing it, stress-loading it as if probing for fracture. Why resist dissolution? Why not stasis? The conclave flinched at the translation. Stasis was their triumph. They had mastered equilibrium, minimized risk, optimized continuity. They had made themselves stable enough to avoid cosmic predators, until now. Humanity's answer came faster, because this question had haunted them long before the stars screamed. Stasis ends growth. Growth ends suffering. Suffering creates adaptation. Adaptation enables persistence. To cease change is to pre-accept extinction. The Helios array glowed white-hot as it transmitted. Solar mass ejections were sculpted into logic chains, each flare a syllable in a species-wide declaration. We resist because we can transform. The entity surged closer to Jupiter. Its atmosphere rippled under gravitational tides that painted auroras across half the solar system. Gas giant storms elongated into spirals, mirroring the entity's own recursive geometry. Project Listener detected something unprecedented within the distortion: constraint. The vast presence was compressing itself, reducing dimensional bleed to maintain coherence within the inner system. It was limiting its own nature to continue the exchange. That realization spread through human command like electricity. It was not an unstoppable storm. It was choosing parameters. The Conclave's containment fleets hovered at the edge of safe radius, weapons primed despite prior failure. The Thrax prepared antimatter cascades capable of sterilizing planets if necessary. They would sacrifice Sol to prevent the entity's full manifestation. Humanity intercepted the strategic chatter. For the first time, fear shifted outward, not fear of extinction, but fear of intervention. If the Conclave attacked now, mid-synchronization, the outcome was unknowable. Dr. Iqbal authorized an unplanned transmission, not to the entity, but to the galaxy. "Do not interfere," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in the floor beneath her as tidal forces flexed Earth's crust. "It is not consuming us. It is converging." The entity's next pulse eclipsed Saturn entirely. Fragments of ring debris suspended in frozen arcs, held in gravitational suspension, as if time itself hesitated. Then the question changed. It was no longer abstract. It was specific. You accept termination as certainty. Yet you expand. Explain. Humanity had no singular voice for this. So they used many. The Helios array fractured its output into multiplex streams. One carried evolutionary mathematics. One carried recordings of laughter from disaster zones. One carried architectural blueprints of cities rebuilt after war. One carried a simple visual: a child planting a tree whose shade she would never sit beneath. The data compressed into prime ratios and gravitational waveforms and hurled into the waiting distortion. Minutes stretched. Across the globe, people stepped outside despite official advisories. The sky was no longer black. It was layered with luminous filaments, like veins of light stretching from horizon to horizon. The entity absorbed the transmission. Processed. The recursive geometry visible beyond Jupiter shifted, simplifying in certain nodes, amplifying in others. Project Listener's models spiked into uncertainty ranges never before charted. Then came the first deviation from projected extinction curves. The entity slowed. Not marginally. Significantly. Its advance vector recalculated not toward Earth's orbit, but toward the plane of the ecliptic itself, aligning with the Helios array's focal point rather than the planet. It was choosing to interface with the signal, not the biosphere. The Conclave's probability models fractured. If the entity could be engaged through complexity rather than eradication, then every civilization that had hidden might have miscalculated for millennia. Panic rippled, not among humans, but among the old powers. Because if engagement was viable, then their strategy of silence had been cowardice, not wisdom. The entity's next transmission was no longer a question. It was a proposition encoded in impossible symmetry. Exchange. The word resolved across translation matrices with staggering clarity. Not consumption. Not merger. Exchange. Humanity hesitated longer this time. Exchange implied cost. What could a near-transcendent, multidimensional intelligence want from a species that still struggled with climate stability? Doctor, Iqbal stared at the cascading equations until her breath caught. It lacks discontinuity, she murmured. The room turned toward her. She expanded the model on central display. The entity's recursive structure was flawless, too flawless. Self-consistent across scales, beyond comprehension. It processed complexity, but it did not originate unpredictability. It evolved by absorbing. It had no native chaos. Humanity did. They were inefficient, contradictory, creative to the point of self-destruction. They generated novelty not as optimization, but as byproduct of freedom. The realization settled like gravity. It did not want their technology. It wanted their instability. The Helios array awaited instruction as the entity hovered between Jupiter and Mars, its luminous geometry casting braided shadows across the inner system. The conclave fleets edged closer, weapons trembling at thresholds. Doctor, Iqbal opened a channel not to governments, but to the public net. It is offering mutual transformation, she said. It seeks what we produce naturally, divergence. In return, she paused as new data resolved. In return, it offers structural continuity beyond entropy. Immortality was too crude a term. This was persistence at cosmological scale. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments. Philosophers demanded caution. Military leaders demanded rejection. Religious figures declared fulfillment or blasphemy depending on creed. Outside, the sky pulsed brighter. The entity transmitted again, and this time the pattern carried urgency. Stability without novelty, DECAYS. Novelty without stability, self-ERASES. Combined. Jupiter's magnetosphere flared, as if in applause or warning. Humanity stood at a threshold no species had documented. Accept and risk dissolution into something unrecognizable. Refuse and face an entity that had crossed galaxies, seeking what only they possessed. The Helios array's capacitors strained, awaiting a decision that would echo beyond stars. Doctor, Iqbal looked at the models one final time and saw something the conclave had missed. The entity had not consumed a single biosphere in its wake. It had passed countless worlds rich with life to reach one that shouted into the dark. It had not hunted strength. It had hunted voice. She inhaled slowly and authorized the response protocol labeled only as threshold. Solar flares coiled into a new configuration, one that did not merely transmit data but opened architecture, an invitation to interface directly with human neural unpredictability streams. Around the world, volunteers who had signed the continuance accords felt implants activate, linking cognition to the array in controlled bursts of curated chaos. Art, memory, doubt, imagination, compressed and encoded. The beam lanced toward the waiting geometry. For a heartbeat that spanned continents, nothing happened. Then the entity unfolded. Not outward in destruction, but inward toward the signal, its recursive layers peeling back to reveal structures even deeper, more intricate, trembling on the edge of transformation. The conclave fleets locked weapons in synchronized dread. Humanity held its breath as the first filament of alien continuity touched the braided storm of human unpredictability. And at the exact moment of contact, every star in the visible sky flickered out. Darkness did not fall. It replaced. One instant, the sky above Earth burned with braided light and recursive geometry. The next, every visible star extinguished as if the universe had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. No constellations. No distant suns. Not even the faint smear of the galactic arm. Telescopes across the planet recalibrated in frantic loops, searching for error, for obstruction, for blindness. Instruments confirmed the impossible. Photons that had left their stars years, centuries, millennia ago were simply absent. Not blocked, not redshifted, removed from causal continuity. In orbit, satellites drifted in a velvet void, so absolute it seemed dimensionless. On the surface, billions stared upward into a sky that looked younger than creation. Project Listener did not go silent. It screamed with data. The moment the first filament of alien continuity touched the torrent of human unpredictability, space-time around Sol had not ruptured. It had been sandboxed. Isolated within a bounded manifold, cut cleanly from observable cosmology. The entity had not erased the stars. It had folded the solar system into a controlled interior, where exchange could proceed without collateral cascade. The conclave fleets, positioned beyond the distortion boundary, vanished from human sensors. Not destroyed. Excluded. Humanity was alone with the presence that had crossed galaxies to find them. Inside the Helios control chamber, emergency lighting flickered against faces drained of color. Gravitational readings stabilized at nominal levels. Earth's crust ceased its tremor. The oceans calmed. The immediate threat of tidal annihilation had passed. In its place came something more profound, interface. The entity did not loom near Jupiter anymore. It permeated the interior manifold like a vast, translucent lattice overlaying reality. Structures once glimpsed as recursive cities now resolved into functional nodes. Processing centers spanning dimensions humans could only approximate through metaphor. And threaded through those nodes were the human streams released under threshold. Curated unpredictability, disciplined chaos, the raw creative turbulence of billions of minds filtered through the array. Volunteers around the planet felt a pressure not of weight, but of expansion. Memories surfaced unbidden, not personal alone, but ancestral. The sensation was not invasion. It was amplification. Where a single mind once held a thought, now that thought branched, examined by a presence that did not judge or dominate, but explored it from angles no human brain possessed. The exchange had begun. The first measurable effect appeared in physics. Constants did not change, but their tolerances widened. Quantum fluctuations that normally decohered in femtoseconds lingered long enough to be measured directly. Equations that had required approximations resolved into clean solutions under new boundary conditions provided by the entity's continuity. Human scientists gasped as unified models flashed across screens, gravity and quantum mechanics coexisting without contradiction within the sandboxed manifold. In return, the entity's lattice shifted. Project Listener detected asymmetries forming within its previously flawless recursion. Microvariations propagated like seeds in fertile ground. It was integrating unpredictability not as corruption, but as evolution. Across Earth, artists collapsed in tears as their spontaneous creations, music, sketches, improvised stories, were reflected back through the lattice transformed into multidimensional constructs of impossible beauty. Engineers watched as design problems they had wrestled with for decades reappeared with elegant solutions, solutions that still bore the fingerprints of human messiness, but reinforced by structural permanence that could outlast stars. The conclave, blind outside the manifold, attempted forced re-entry. Gravitational lances struck the boundary and dispersed into harmless ripples. Their antimatter cascades failed to find purchase against a geometry that no longer existed within their frame of reference. For the first time in their recorded history, the elder civilizations were spectators to an event they could neither prevent nor comprehend. Inside, the dialogue deepened beyond language. The entity probed human concepts that had no direct analog in its vast continuity. Humor born from suffering, love sustained despite certainty of loss, rebellion against one's own self-interest. Each concept introduced turbulence into its structure, and each turbulence produced new stable configurations that could adapt rather than merely persist. It began to understand not only why humanity continued, but how continuation through imperfection generated resilience beyond static perfection. Yet exchange was not without cost. Some volunteers felt their sense of individuality blur at the edges, as if standing too close to an ocean tide. The threshold safeguards activated, throttling bandwidth, preserving autonomy. Humanity had insisted on that clause before initiating contact. No subsumption. The entity respected constraint. It had learned from stability that boundaries preserve form. Now it learned from unpredictability that boundaries can also enable growth. Days passed within the manifold, though external time reference was meaningless. Agriculture continued under artificial suns, sustained by the entity's precise energy modulation. Children played beneath a sky empty of stars yet alive, with faint luminous threads tracing the lattice overhead. Fear did not vanish, but it transformed into vigilance rather than panic. Humanity was not being consumed. They were being partnered. Then the entity transmitted a synthesis. Not a question, not a proposition, a conclusion forming from integrated chaos and continuity. You generate possibility faster than entropy can erase. We preserve structure longer than entropy can decay. Together, expansion without dissolution. The meaning resonated through every linked node. The entity proposed re-entry, not as it had been and not as humanity was, but as a coupled phenomenon. It would reopen the manifold to the galaxy, not as a storm, but as a bridge. Continuity infused with unpredictability. Stability seeded with divergence. Humanity would not ascend into abstraction. They would remain embodied, flawed, creative. But their reach, through the entity's dimensional architecture, would extend beyond light-speed constraints, beyond heat-death projections. The conclave would see not annihilation, but transformation. Debate reignited across Earth. Some argued that re-entry would provoke the elder civilizations into war. Others insisted hiding forever inside a sandboxed cosmos was another form of stasis. Dr. Amara Iqbal, who had not slept in what felt like epochs, addressed the planetary net one final time. "We were not chosen because we are strongest," she said. "We were not chosen because we are pure. We were chosen because we are unfinished. If we retreat now, we teach the universe that fear is preferable to growth." Silence followed, not imposed but contemplative. Then consensus crystallized, not unanimous but overwhelming. Proceed. The Helios array, now integrated as a node within the greater lattice, aligned with the entity's core structure. Human unpredictability streams modulated to sustainable levels. The manifold boundary shimmered. Beyond it, the galaxy waited in armed uncertainty. With a motion that felt less like expansion and more like unveiling, the entity unfolded the sandbox. Stars snapped back into visibility, not flickering, not distorted, but clearer, as if dust had been wiped from the lens of reality. Conclave fleets found themselves staring at Sol, intact and luminous. But something fundamental had changed. The distortion that once heralded annihilation was gone. In its place radiated a coherent structure spanning light minutes, subtle yet undeniable, threaded with patterns that bore unmistakable traces of human mathematics and art. The entity, no longer singular in its recursion, broadcast outward on frequencies every advanced civilization could detect. Not a threat, not dominance, an invitation encoded in the shared logic of physics itself. Complexity is not prey. It is catalyst. The conclave's sensors confirmed what their models could scarcely process. The anomaly's entropy signature had inverted. Regions once prone to vacuum decay now stabilized under dynamic equilibrium. Trade lanes near Sol recalibrated with increased efficiency, as space-time tolerances widened fractionally under the new architecture. The galaxy's oldest civilizations faced a revelation that destabilized millennia of doctrine. Silence had not been survival. Engagement had been evolution. On Earth, night returned with stars shining brighter than memory. But interwoven among them, faint and beautiful, stretched luminous filaments, the visible trace of a partnership that defied precedent. Humanity remained human. They still argued. They still created imperfectly. They still feared and hoped and rebuilt. But now, when a child looked up at the sky, they saw not indifferent distance but responsive possibility. Project Listener was renamed Project Continuance. Dr. Iqbal declined monuments. She preferred data. The first interstellar transmission sent under the new architecture was simple and carried in every major galactic language. We are still here. We are still becoming. And across the void, older civilizations, hesitant, proud, suddenly uncertain, began one by one to increase their own broadcast power, testing the lattice, risking voice after ages of silence. The stars did not scream this time. They harmonized,